more of them than you kind of wish there were if you're Catherine of Medici. And so she thinks, well, what am I going to do about these Huguenots? And she actually issues 2 edicts of toleration that give the Huguenots basically the license to exist. So they're not going to be killed. This is a good thing for the Huguenots. The second one gives them a little bit more existence. They can actually meet and worship in public without being worried about getting hauled off to the bishop or whatever. The problem was the Huguenots began to seize churches in the south. So here, it's give them an inch, they take another inch. They're taking another church, and another church, and another church. Well, that wasn't what they wanted. And so this first war of religion started, what's called the First War of Religion in France. I think you could probably just as easy call it a war of succession, because what's in play really is who's going to be king of France. And the Huguenots, bless their hearts, saw an opportunity and took it. And so they're stirring up trouble, and there's violence. Trying to tell both sides of the story. Okay. Now, the Huguenots, as part of their, I think truly we could call this as part of this next episode, as part of their evangelism plan. They kidnapped the king, King Charles. Actually, they just tried to. They didn't really kidnap him. Because they thought, if we can just get to this kid, we could convince him that Calvin's right and that the whole country should be reformed. And what could be better than that? Well, it didn't come off, and that set off a whole nother round of fighting. Second war of religion. Then there was peace, then there was more fighting, then there was another peace. And so now we're, in case you've lost track, we're on the third war of religion in France. King Charles, still Henry, the one who died in the tournament, son. We're still trying to get somebody solid on the throne. Okay, so the third war of religion ends. How? All of you who are mothers, I know you've said this at one point. The diplomacy I do around my house, I could help out some. Well, it was 2 mothers who ended the third round of the wars of religion in France. Catherine de Medici was one of them, and the other one was Jean of Albret. She was the Queen of Navarre. And so you say, where on earth is Navarre? Let me tell you, Navarre is over there in between France and Spain. Exactly, I heard that. Yes, so think what we got going on now. We've got not a solid king on the throne of France. We've got Italy stirred up. We've got Spain down there who really wants everything, and we'll hear more about them in a little bit. Spain, if you notice, and let's just take a second to look at the colors on this map. Yellow, that light yellow, is Roman Catholic. So you can see Spain is clearly, solidly Roman Catholic. Navarre has some areas of Calvinist influence. Now it hasn't moved into dark blue, but it's in there, along with the south of France and other parts of France. And then you see, even politically, how Navarre is kind of like a reformed, it's the peanut butter in a Roman Catholic sandwich there. And so the kings and queens of Navarre they're always trying to figure out who's the best person to ally with. Usually they go with Spain. Jean of Albret is a little different. And I want to tell you who you are and or who she is, and remind you of somebody we learned about last year. Jean is the daughter of Marguerite of Navarre. Now, we met her last year. She was a queen. So you think back one generation. She's right in the middle of it. And she was the queen who came to court in France. And she wanted to know what is going on. Now, she never converted that we know of. But she was very interested. And she got some of those ladies in waiting. She found out the ones who were Protestant. And she got them to tell her about this new faith. And so her daughter, Jean, we could call her Jeannie maybe, she converted to the Reformed side of Protestantism publicly in 1560. Okay, it's another date, never mind. And she became the leader of the Huguenots. Why? We've got another woman. She's also very powerful. She can kind of keep Spain, in her backyard, Spain, at bay, but she feels very strongly about the Reformation and the ideas that have come, and she thinks that Calvin is right. And so publicly, she converts and she becomes their leader. Well, she met with, let me go back to this slide. She met with Catherine of Medici and to see if they couldn't resolve this third go-round in these wars and just get them done with. Because, we've got royal living that we need to get on with. So the result was what Jeannie bargained for was that the Huguenots could actually hold public office in France. So not only now could they worship publicly and actually kind of come out from the shadows, they could hold public office in France. Now, that sounds like a secular thing, doesn't it? So again, back to our question, was this a religious war or was it something else that religion was bound up in? And you can probably tell I think it's the latter. Because now we've got Huguenots who can hold public office in France. And so, because she was negotiating all of this, she had to go to court to, Catherine's court, not the judge. And it's very interesting because she wrote back to her son, Henry, who she was going to marry off to Catherine's daughter. And I'll talk a little bit about them. You see them down at the bottom. But she wrote to Henry of Navarre. And I think we talked about this last year. It's like this couldn't be complicated enough, but also everybody has the same names. So this is another Henry. So I've spelled his name, I think, with a Y. Henry the Huguenot. He's got, just wait till we get to Henry the Huguenot. Anyway, at this time, he's not married, and she writes back to him after she's arranged his wedding. She says to him, "Not for anything on earth would I have you come to live here. Although I knew it was bad, I find it even worse than I feared. Here it is the women who make advances to the men, rather than the other way around. If you were here, you would never escape without special intervention from God." These French women, Henry, they're dangerous. We got to get you married to this one, but after that, don't be hanging around here. So it's very interesting the way Jeannie portrays the women of the French court. Now I want to tell you, it's interesting the way that women are portrayed. This is a little bit of a side note, but because there's so many women involved, both sides slung mud at the other side's women. So let me tell you what the Catholics in the French court thought about the Protestant women, the Huguenots who were worshiping. This is what one of the Catholics says, it's worth noting that during this time, this is the same time, a number of women in French cities and princes and gentlemen of France, even at court and among the king's attendants, were beguiled by that Lutheran religion. Now, it's interesting that he calls it the Lutheran religion. So that's another thing. It's like they don't know their players yet. Okay, they're not dealing with Lutherans. They're dealing with Calvinists. Okay, that Lutheran religion. These women, in order to attend the assemblies, would steal away from their husbands, who were totally unsuspecting because they remained Catholics. Some of the women were accompanied by their chambermaids, others by their own daughters, so as to avoid awakening their husbands' suspicions when they went to the aforesaid secret assemblies, which took place largely at night and during the evening. Most, when they first went, were chaste wives and girls, but on their return were whores and sluts on account of their meetings. So, the women sometimes seem to also be lightning rods. You know, it was Eve's fault. It's the French ladies in waiting in court. Stay away from them. Don't be going out at night with those Protestant women. Okay? So interesting to see how, even though these women have so much power, and they are really the top of their government right now, women are portrayed in those sorts of ways, anywhere underneath that. We'll hear a little bit more about Catherine de' Medici after a little while. So, back to Jeannie, Henry of Navarre's mom. She went to Paris for the wedding, and unfortunately, she died right before the wedding. Now, there were rumors. They've pretty much determined these rumors are not true, that she died of natural causes of some sort of fever. But there were rumors that Catherine de' Medici had sent her a poisoned glove. And she put it on, and that was the end of Jeannie of Navarre. But at any rate, she died. And the kids got married. Henry of Navarre and Marguerite of Valois. She is one of the youngest children of Henry, the guy who died in the tournament, and Catherine de' Medici. Now, at this point, you got to think, you know, this is just a nice conciliatory wedding to try and get the Protestants and the Catholics to play nice. There was both of them are way down on the maybe could be king or queen list. They're not contenders. So really, we're just trying to get along here, folks. So they get married. So now let me tell you just a little bit about Henry of Navarre. He was actually baptized as a Catholic, but as you can imagine, what I've just told you about his mom, he was raised as a Protestant. So this will come back, and we will see what Henry does with his own faith. This is a clue. So, August 18th, 1572, they got married. The wedding was a problem. Not only was the wedding itself on thin ice, but the festivities leading up to it drew a lot of people together in Paris from both sides. So you've got Paris, City of Lights, strange courtiers, and here comes the Huguenots. The leader of the Huguenots, whose name was Admiral Coligny, and I only tell you his name to just try and keep him separate from all the other characters we've got going on. He came to Paris. He had an invitation to the wedding, so he came to Paris because he thought, you know, this is not a bad idea. I'm going to be right there with Marguerite's brother, the King of France. I'm going to try and lobby him to help the Protestants who are fighting in the Netherlands. Because right now here in France, we're doing pretty well, but they're fighting Spain in the Netherlands. Okay, never mind all that. That's a whole nother story. So he goes to lobby. On his way back from the meeting with the king at the palace of the Louvre, probably, somebody tries to kill him. Well, thankfully, they just got him in the hand and his arm, so he went on home. He was fine for a while. Who tried to kill him? This truly is a mystery of history. Oh, that rhymes. I never thought of that. Anyway, we don't know. It is much more possible that Catherine de' Medici arranged for the assassination attempt, because she was worried about the growing Huguenot influence with the king. She's marrying her daughter off to a Huguenot. She's letting them carouse together. She does not want to lose power. So we don't know who called for the assassination of this guy, but Catherine de' Medici is as likely a suspect as anyone, and she clearly would have had the power to try and pull it off. Well, as you can imagine, the Huguenots were really, really perturbed. They insisted that there be retribution. They are not taking this one laying down. No, sir. So, between the assassination attempt and the Huguenots' agitation, there are rumors flying all over Paris. Now, I know that they didn't have social media like we have social media now, because we're always talking about, oh, things go instantly. Well, these rumors went almost instantly around Paris, from one courtier's mouth, not to God's ear, but to another courtier's mouth. And pretty soon, all of Paris is tense and on edge. And what's going to happen? One of the rumors flying around was that there were actually Huguenot armies outside of Paris waiting, ready to bust in and take over Paris. Now, if you remember from that map, Paris was not one of the reformed places. It's still in the solidly Catholic part of France. So rumors are flying. Charles, is that who we're on? Charles, yes, Charles the King, orders a preemptive strike. Just a little one. Just a little preemptive strike against the Huguenots. And one of the Catholics in his stable went to kill Coligny. So they were going to actually finish, whoever ordered the first assassination attempt that hadn't worked, they were actually going to go and finish it off. So they're thinking, he's the head of him, let's kill him, we'll just, nip it in the bud and maybe things will calm down. They tossed his body out of a window so he could be identified, and then they dragged him through the streets. And that was the beginning of what is called now the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It was the evening of August 23rd into the 24th of 1572. And truly, all hell broke loose. You can see, if you just kind of look at the different parts of this painting, it was painted after the fact by a Protestant refugee who fled to Geneva. We think that maybe Francois Dubois actually survived the massacre. We don't know, but we do know he got a lot of his information from Protestant sources about the massacre. And so you can see on the left is the River Seine, and there's a church, Saint-Germain Church is on the left side, the one with the kind of steeple. That's where the Huguenots were laying in wait, supposedly outside the city of Paris. The big castle-looking thing at the back, that's the Louvre. And then on the far right, the 3-story building, you can see a man kind of dangling out of there. That's Admiral Coligny after he was killed, and they're tossing him out the window. There were some attempts to restrain the violence. One of the not good ideas that they employed to try and restrain the violence was to issue lists of Protestants to be protected. So like, oh no, these are the Navarres, don't kill them. They're, allies. Well, as you can imagine, in this frenzy that followed, fueled by this murder, along with all the rumors that had been flying, these lists became basically execution lists of people to pick up to execute. So many Protestants were executed. Some of the killings had a ritual nature, so they would, before Protestants were killed, they were forced to recant their faith. Sometimes they were made to pray what were considered then Catholic prayers, and some really much more horrible kind of ritualistic torture and murder that we don't even need to talk about, because if we turn on our news, we could probably hear about it. Anyway, it just kept going, and it went for several weeks. It left Paris, and I'll show you now on this map, all of those little kind of hatch marks, the triangles, are places around France where the violence, where word had spread and the violence continued. I'll tell you, not, of course, all Roman Catholics participated in this violence. In fact, as we hear also in so many stories, in fact, Ellie just came home from the Netherlands and Germany and visited some of the World War II sites. And so just as Christians hid Jews during World War II, so did Catholics hide Protestants in this horrible time of this extended massacre. So there were Catholics, in fact, some hid so many that they had to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to buy food so that we're not noticed? So even those kind of stories that we're used to hearing from more recent times happened during this time as well. So not everyone was out for bloodlust. Interestingly enough, on the international front, now remember, we've got Spain, Italy, England, Scotland. All these nations know what's going on. Interestingly, even when they found out about this massacre, Queen Elizabeth, Protestant Queen Elizabeth, did not break relations with France. Nope. There's other things maybe that are more important. Now, there were some people in the English court who dressed in mourning, and when the French ambassador actually came back to London to be at the court, refused to speak to him or even look at him. But that wasn't at the top level. That was not at the level of international diplomacy. Relations were not cut. And if you think over on the other side, the German side of France, the Holy Roman Empire, remember? Not? The Holy Roman Emperor at the time happened to be Charles' father-in-law. He was living under the Peace of Augsburg. Do you remember the Peace of Augsburg? Whose kingdom? His religion. So they had, at that point, kind of carved out a space of peace to kind of get along with each other, at least not bug each other so much that they were killing each other. Now, we'll find out in a little bit that that doesn't continue. But at this point, during and after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the Holy Roman Emperor said, to settle religious disputes by the sword or through force is neither possible nor morally justifiable. So, Holy Roman Empire to the east of France, what are you thinking? You can't settle religious differences with violence. Stop it already. Well, guess what? It didn't stop. King Charles died of tuberculosis. believe it or not, Catherine de' Medici is still on stage, and she goes back in and is regent again until this son, Henry III, another Henry, comes back. He had been off being King of Poland, which is another complicated, connected story that we're not going to go into. But he had to have some time to get from Poland back to France, and so thank goodness Catherine was still there, and she stepped in and took over for him. Now, remember Henry of Navarre, the one whose wedding kicked off all of this? He was still in Paris with his bride of now for 4 years. Finally, in 1576, he gets the heck out of there. It's as if you could hear his mother's words in the back of his head. I would not wish for you to be here for anything. So he gets out of Dodge, he leaves Paris, and he reconverts to Protestantism. Now, it's not clear what Henry's religion was up to this point. Remember, he was baptized a Catholic. His mom was this committed public Huguenot, but he marries this Roman Catholic French princess, and he's in Paris. So, when in Rome. So he escapes from the French court, goes back to Protestantism. There's another peace settlement, and everyone breathes for a little while. However, the Catholics form what's called the Holy League. In case any of you know this history, I don't want to leave out the Holy League, but they started the war again, and it just keeps going for another 8-10 years. Well, once more, somebody dies, and Henry of Navarre, if his brother-in-law, this guy, dies without heirs, Henry of Navarre is going to be king of France because he's married to the French princess. And they've actually now gotten down to the point that he's actually next in line. So remember what I said about War of Succession that just keeps going on with Catherine de' Medici's kids? It turns out that Henry III was killed after submitting to pressure from the Holy League, outlawing Protestant worship, and bringing even more war against the Protestants. However, I want to circle back and go across the continent, or across the channel just for a second. So let's just recap where we are, because if this isn't convoluted, I don't know what is. So we got your Roman Catholic Spain, we got your Navarre, who's solidly smushed in between Roman Catholic Spain and kind of whatever France. Navarre is solidly reformed. France, they're fighting. Well, don't forget about England. Queen Elizabeth is on the throne in England. And she, even though she didn't cut off diplomatic relations, she's secretly helping. She's funding. She's sending arms. I don't know what. She's funding, she's sending arms. She's supporting the Protestants who are fighting in France. And she's welcoming refugees. So if any of you have been to Canterbury Cathedral, has anybody been to Canterbury Cathedral? They're in the, I'm sure we're not supposed to call it the basement. It's what's next to the crypt in the basement of Canterbury Cathedral, is still an active sanctuary, literally, sanctuary for a French congregation that has been going since this time. So there were French Protestant refugees who fled across the channel. Canterbury's right there, basically on the coast. And they were welcomed and given a place in the cathedral to hold their worship. And that French congregation is still going. So Elizabeth is not actively engaging, but she's doing what she thinks she can. The King of Spain, Philip II, he's down there. He married Queen Mary, that's Bloody Mary, not Mary, Queen of Scots. So Marys, Henrys, I don't even, when I was preparing this, I'm thinking, could I rename these people? So this Mary is Catholic also. She's the one that's Queen Elizabeth's half-sister, remember? And she's the one that under her reign, they hauled out their broken wooden rood screens and put them back up. Well, she married, after the death of her first husband, married Philip II. Then she died. Okay. Philip II, he's still Catholic. He still wishes, he was still married to Mary, and he had England as his, part of his reign. So he's not happy on any front. He's not happy power-wise, he's not happy marriage-wise, he's not happy Roman Catholic-wise. So in 1588, he sends the Armada, the Spanish Armada. Now, even if you don't know what the Spanish Armada is, it just sounds big, doesn't it? It was the force to be defeated. You cannot say how big and scary the Spanish Armada was. So they went across the English Channel, and Queen Elizabeth rode down to the coast on a big white horse. She gave a big speech to her troops, and the English fleet went out into the Channel, and they started to engage the Spanish Armada. And they had some success. But then a huge wind came up and blew the Spanish Armada totally off course, off kilter. They could not go back out the same way they came. They were forced, because they were so big, their ships couldn't maneuver as well. They had to go all the way up around the east coast of England, around the top of Scotland, down by Ireland, and then back to Spain. They got whooped. And that wind is called the Great Protestant Wind. And there's a verse in Job that talks about he blew with his winds and they were scattered. And so the English, especially the English Navy and Queen Elizabeth, latched on to that verse and said, whoa boy, that's what just happened here. And so this portrait of Queen Elizabeth shows the fleet in the background, and they actually cast these medallions that they were so fond of casting to celebrate this monumental defeat. And truly, it was an unbelievable defeat. And so Spain really now is, for a little while anyway, out of the picture. So as I said, Henry III was assassinated. Again, probably political intrigue, we don't know. Henry of Navarre claims the throne and fights to take Paris. Now, he doesn't just walk in and take Paris. He actually has to fight, and it takes several years. And is he Protestant or is he Catholic? Remember, he left. He fled Paris and converted to Protestantism. Sometimes people call him Henry the Good. Sometimes people call him Henry the Great. I think of him as Henry the Flip-Flop. Because there he was born, 1553, baptized Catholic, Protestant mom, 1572, marries a Roman Catholic princess, 1576, gets the heck out of Paris, reconverts to Catholicism, 1593, trying desperately to take the capital of France, Paris, converts to Catholicism. Now, it is a wrong fact. This is, what do we call this? Fake news. It is fake news. He did not actually say Paris is worth a mass, but that's kind of what was going on. So the implication of this Paris is worth a mass was like, okay, I'll convert and do a mass, and then Paris will let me in. Well, he didn't say it, but in effect, that's what happened. He re-converts to Catholicism. The fighting continues until finally everyone surrenders. And in 1598, what is called the Edict of Nantes is signed. It's not that much different than any of the other edicts that have been signed and broken and signed and broken and signed and broken over the last decades. This one says the Huguenots have freedom of conscience, but they can only worship in specific places. You can't just go down the street. I'm sorry if the Huguenots thought this was a lovely Roman Catholic church, or let's just say they had their eyes on Holy Family in South Pass. Not allowed. You're allowed to worship here on Virginia Road in San Marino, but don't be going into South Pass, okay? And they had 200 towns that were kind of theirs that they could fortify. So they were really strongholds, I think we would call them. And that was the result of the Edict of Nantes. We will not go any further with that tonight, or I think in the rest of our class. But this edict also gets broken. Why? Because the ruler, when it was broken, was Roman Catholic, and he did not like the idea of those fortified towns. He didn't want anything fortified that wasn't his. And so the Edict of Nantes eventually gets broken. So, lots of war over a period of decades. Peace was made with Spain. The Huguenots and the Roman Catholics got along for a while. But religious wars didn't end. And so when we come back in about 10 minutes, we'll see what happened to the east of France in the Holy Roman Empire when we see that the Peace of Augsburg couldn't hold either. Okay. Alrighty then. Come back for more war. I'm going to do the review part while you're all gathering into your seats and say that we are moving east now. Germany is east of France, isn't it? Yes, thank you. Okay. We are moving east, and we are going to look at the 30 Years' War. And I just want to remind you of the questions that I want to keep in mind. Were these religious wars? And what's the church's relationship to power? Okay. We're back east in Europe with Charles V, and I just want to remind you who he was. He was the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. He's the one that tried again and again and again to exert Catholic control. He was the one, he worked with Pope Leo. He's the one that hauled Martin Luther up to trial in Worms, and amazing things happened in his life. Cortez sailed to the Americas, so there's there's new world exploration going on under this guy. He's fighting the Protestants. And on everything else, this man, I really believe, was actually a committed person of faith. Because shortly before he died, he was still trying to, get all of Europe to be Roman Catholic. But in 1555, remember, the Peace of Augsburg was reached before he died. Now, he actually abdicated. He gave up his empire and went and spent his last couple years in a monastery, because that was what you did if you were a Roman Catholic and you were committed to your faith and you knew you had a lifetime worth of who knows even what all you've done. So he finished up in a monastery. So the Peace of Augsburg, remember, cuius regio, eius religio, whose kingdom, his faith. That was the Peace of Augsburg. It stayed, it was working until it didn't. It would have been fine if people had just stayed put, but they didn't stay in the boundaries. They got married, they converted, they moved, the Grass was greener on the other side of the mountain, so they went. So this went on for 60 years, and the Peace of Augsburg was tested again and again and again until it broke. And when it broke, this very long, horrible war ensued, 30 years. Now, the wars of religion in France actually went on for a little bit longer, but there were actual breaks in between. There was really, as you'll see, no break in the 30 Years' War. So you can see, just take a look at this map of Europe. The yellow, again, is Roman Catholic. Blue is Roman Catholic with some Protestant minorities. Orange is Lutheran. Pink is Calvinist. So you can see that Europe is really divided. Yeah, it's very divided. It doesn't look like one empire, does it? It looks like a bunch of fiefdoms, which is totally anachronistic, but anyway. So people moved, and even though they're all part of one Holy Roman Empire, they are divided. And when the Peace of Augsburg broke, it broke in a big way, and the war just kept going and going and going. Sorry, I put my pages together during the break, and I should not have. So there were 4 phases. The first one was the Bohemian phase. We call it because of Frederick III, who was a Calvinist, and the Elector, the Prince of the Palatinate. We've probably heard of the Palatinate when we did our Presbyterian history and confirmation. But there it is. It's teeny tiny around Mainz. Very, very small place. So Frederick was the prince. He was a Calvinist. Everything was going well until Ferdinand II came along. He was the great nephew, that's Ferdinand right there. He was the great nephew of Charles V, and you can see a little bit of that Spanish family resemblance in there. He was the king of Bohemia, and I'll show you where Bohemia is in a second. He was not happy with the Peace of Augsburg. So he sent some members of his court to meet with some of the aristocratic Bohemian Protestant princes in Prague. And they had a meeting which did not go very well. It ended in what is known as the defenestration of Prague. Why defenestration? Fenestre is the old French word for window. So if you are defenestered, it means you get tossed out of a window. All right, so there's a lot of window tossing going on in all of this time. So what happened was they had this meeting, and they were meeting at the top floor of this building that still exists. In fact, here's what it looks like. There's the window. It's much taller than it looks in the contemporary woodcut, doesn't it? Anyway, so they're meeting on the top floor of this building. They disagreed. The Protestant princes threw Ferdinand's Catholic court members out the windows onto the ground, onto some sort of padding. Now, if I'm a Catholic historian and I'm telling this story, I say, oh, thankfully, there was straw at the bottom of that window because that's where they, stabled all the horses. So thank God, straw. If I'm a Protestant historian telling the story, I say, you're right, there was padding. It was not straw. That was the other part of horses. It was the manure. And they landed in a pile of you-know-what. So, again, a very small difference in the ways that we tell history. The Catholics got up and walked off, but we say what they landed on at the bottom was a little different. So there's the actual building. And so back to our map. So it created some problems. Ferdinand was furious. He was on the war path. He fought with everybody. And remember, over there by Mainz is that tiny little Palatinate where Frederick is a prince. So they went to war, and over there is Prague. And you can see that yellow, the pink, that's Bohemia. The purple underneath there is Bohemia. So Bohemia's big. Ferdinand's got a big area. Frederick's got a teeny little area, but they actually go to war. Because why? All the Protestant Bohemian princes over there in the purple asked Frederick to be their prince. And Frederick thought, that's a little bigger place, isn't it? I could try and do that. So they went to war. Ferdinand, of course, was still really perturbed. He appealed to all the Catholic princes, and they went to battle, and Frederick, the Protestant from the Palatinate, lost. And now Ferdinand, the Catholic from Prague, has taken over Bohemia, and remember, he's the one that does not like the Peace of Augsburg. He thinks every place should still be Catholic. So that's the reason this first phase is called the Bohemian phase. The Battle of White Mountain was one of the first battles in this phase of the war. And we begin here to see how the war flip-flopped. It wasn't just Henry of Navarre flip-flopping between religions. This war went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Ferdinand defeated Frederick, laid waste to Bohemia, took over the Palatinate, and by 1622, both of them are Roman Catholic because their ruler was. The problem was, and here's to your question, a huge number of Calvinists did not convert back to Catholicism, and they still live there. Now, we're getting pretty far away from the Reformation. We're 100 years away, actually. 1517, Martin Luther did the Wittenberg door thing. Now we're 100 years on. We've got generations of families and communities that have been Protestant. So it's not as if they're going to reconvert to Catholicism because they've never been Catholic. They're Protestant. They know what they are. They don't want to be something different. So it's a problem. And if you are just living as a regular, ordinary peasant, which most of us would have been at the time, we would have hoped that the war would have ended when the Roman Catholic took over, even if he forced our conversion. So we're not going to convert on our own volition, and maybe we're going to do like some of the people did in England and stick our Bibles underneath our pillows. Whatever's happening on the power level. So by 1625, it's gone for 7 years. And people are thinking, oh, okay, Ferdinand won, it's over. War over, right? No, not so much. It moves into a second phase, the Danish phase. And I want you to notice historians name these phases after places. And actually used to, before the 1990s, used to ask if this was the last war of religion or the First World War. Now they don't ask so much if it was the last war of religion because we've seen wars of religion since then. But they do still wonder if this was the First World War because so much of Europe was involved. So, the Danish phase. Believe it or not, the King of Denmark wanted to expand his lands into Central Europe. Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? He was a Protestant. He was a Lutheran. Denmark was Lutheran. So Christian, his name was Christian, the fourth, not the first Christian. He was the fourth Christian of Denmark. He hooked up with Protestant princes who wanted to defeat those Roman Catholic usurpers of their lands. So the Scandinavians sent princes to the Netherlands, and now also people from England go up against the Catholics. So you can see, I just put this map up, don't bother about the lines, but you can see where Denmark is there and how they're coming down from the north. And we're going to have other Scandinavian princes coming down from the north as well. I want to introduce you to this guy whose name is Albrecht of Wallenstein. He was an amazing general, military strategist. I think if we were studying military history, which we are not, believe it or not, he's still considered a foremost military strategist. So if you're at West Point, I think you still read Albrecht of Wallenstein. He's from the part of Europe that we think of as Czechoslovakia. He was raised as a Protestant, but somewhere in there converted to Catholicism. He was also a mercenary, which was not that unusual at this time. There were mercenary armies that went around and worked for hire. He got a lot of money for winning wars. He did. He was a major mercenary at this time period. So by 1628, he had a personal army of 100,000 men. Bigger than any other national army in Europe. Now, one thing you need to know about this time is that we are just at the beginning of what historians call nationalism, nation building in Europe. We're moving away from empires that are big and unwieldy down to nations that are possibly unwieldy but smaller. So he has this private army that's bigger than anybody else, any king's army. So he actually got hired by Ferdinand. Now he's the Catholic. He's not the Christian Dane, he's the Catholic. And he systematically trounced the Protestant forces. So too bad, Christian IV of Denmark. Ferdinand, they totally lost. There was an edict, made Calvinism illegal. Problem is 40% of the people are still Calvinist. He demanded the return of Catholic churches, so here we are in the formerly Holy Roman Catholic Church of San Marino, and we have to give it back. There was the Treaty of Lubeck at the same time, and the people out plowing the fields thought, okay, end of the war. Not so much. We move into the third phase, the Swedish phase. Gustavus Adolphus. Some of you, who's heard of Gustavus Adolphus College? Yes, great Minnesota. Oh yeah, you would know about Gustavus. Great Minnesota College. When I first started doing this history, I was like, oh, that's where they got that strange name for that college. Anyway, he's a famous Lutheran king of Sweden. Believe it or not, just like Christian, he wanted to move in Central Europe too. He wanted to be Protestant. He wanted Europe to be Protestant, but really he's in it for Sweden. Now, here's the part that gets interesting. He begins to get advice, military advice, from Cardinal, Lutherans don't have cardinals, Cardinal Richelieu of France. France is a Catholic country. Cardinal Richelieu is as Catholic as they come. So France, a solidly Roman Catholic country, is giving a solidly Protestant king military advice. And so the fighting begins again. Gustavus Adolphus goes to battle against the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, which are still led by Albrecht of Wallenstein. And lo and behold, thanks to Cardinal Richelieu, Wallenstein, the great mercenary private army guy, was defeated. Yes, exactly, he was defeated. But the fighting continued. Then Gustavus Adolphus happened to be killed in battle. And the thing was, now here we are back to how many children do you have? He only had one. I think she was a girl. She was. Christina of Sweden. A girl, not a woman. She was a child. Obviously, she's not in a position to lead the Swedish armies. The Swedish armies know this, and they say, meh, I don't want to do this. So they literally put down their arms and go back to Sweden. And that is the end of the Swedish phase of war. Yeah. I want to, at this point though, it's so easy to whip through this and forget, because it has so much to do with power. It's not about, I mean, it's a teeny bit about religion, but it's a lot bit about power. And so I want to read you just a short excerpt from a document that's called The Destruction of Magdeburg, and that's where Magdeburg is up there. I've marked it on the map. And this is an account by the mayor, the Burgermeister of Magdeburg, who recorded the destruction of his city by imperial, they were Catholic troops that destroyed the city. Then there was naught but beating and burning, plundering, torture, and murder. Most especially was every one of the enemy bent on securing much booty. When a marauding party entered a house, if its master had anything to give, he might thereby purchase respite and protection for himself and his family until the next man, who also wanted something, should come along. It was only when everything had been brought out and there was nothing left to give that the real trouble started. Then, what with blows and threats of shooting, stabbing, and hanging, the poor people were so terrified that if they had anything left, they would have given it if it had been buried in the earth or hidden away in 1,000 castles. In this frenzied rage, the great and splendid city that had stood like a fair princess in the land was now, in its hour of direst need and unutterable distress and woe, given over to the flames, and thousands of innocent men, women, and children, in the midst of a horrible din of heartrending shrieks and cries, were tortured and put to death in so cruel and shameful a manner that no words would suffice to describe it, nor no tears to bewail it. So that was the impact of these wars on ordinary people like us. You can just imagine, hide my wedding ring and hopefully we can keep it. Then the wedding ring's gone and there's nothing else to give. And then you're at their mercy, which was not merciful. So at the end of the Swedish fades, there was another peace. They tried. It was not the end of the war. Then it moves into the Swedish-French phase. And now it's not just Cardinal Richelieu giving advice in the wings. They're actually both Sweden and French armies, Swedish and French armies go together. And this is where I started. There's a saying that politics makes strange bedfellows, and I think this is a prime example. So remember what we had in the first part of it, the French wars of religion, where there was some peace, but now the French are getting mixed up in the war, in the 30 Years' War to their east. And at this point, it was basically war for war's sake. The fighting was good for France. It was not good for Sweden. They were afraid that the Holy Roman Empire was going to take over all of Scandinavia. So their situation was a lot scarier than France's. France just wants to get rid of the dynasty that's now ruling the Holy Roman Empire. The fighting is not in France. It's east, so their homeland is not threatened at all. And the French armies, they've not been fighting for decades. So they're fresh. The rest of Europe is pooped, and poop probably too. During this stage, the war was even more destructive. Cities were completely destroyed. Central Europe was devastated. And by 1645, the people had had it. And perhaps even more strategically important, Cardinal Richelieu had died. He had actually been stirring the pot, encouraging the fighting. But Louis XIV had become King of France, and he decided he just didn't need this war. And so he said, okay, that's it. So finally, in 1648, the treaty or the Peace of Westphalia was signed. It rescinded Ferdinand's edict of restitution, so all the churches revert. Protestants got their Protestant churches back, Catholics got their Catholic churches back. This treaty formally recognized Calvinism as legal. It also recognized the Swiss cantons and the Netherlands as separate entities. They're separate from Spain, separate from the Holy Roman Empire. But in Central Europe, it has solidified the political, and this is funny to say, it solidified the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. So again, things really are at this point falling apart. So who won? Who won this war? Not the ordinary people. Nationalism won. So as opposed to being subject to either a ruler or a religion, people were now really subject to what was a nation state. So it becomes easier to kill or revolt against a king. So this gets at your questions in the break as well. If your king or queen, your ruler, as was understood in the Middle Ages, was put on the throne by God, it would really be bad to get rid of him. It would really be bad to kill a king, because you're killing somebody that God has put on the throne. Now we see in all of this mess, both in France and in what I'll call Germany now, that kind of gets pushed aside. There's so many, and it's not just one, it's a bunch. We've got Frederick, we've got Christian, we've got, all these smaller rulers. And they seem not so invincible, not so God ordained. So nationalism really comes on the stage at this point. France was a clear winner. They got all kinds of territories around their borders. Plus they still had all kinds of money because they had only fought toward the end and the rest of Europe was bankrupt. So France came out a very strong player. International diplomacy was a winner because different areas began negotiating. So in spite of the horror, people started getting practice negotiating between themselves in smaller areas. It goes along with nationalism. And finally, lest we underestimate who pays for all this, international financiers and bankers came out ahead. They had to be paid back for the loans that were taken out during the war, but also all those cities like Magdeburg had to be rebuilt. And so there was a serious level of national debt. And the European stock market came into being. People and countries raised money on speculation. And some of you might know the story of tulips, that, wow, you could pay gazillions of dollars for a tulip shortly after this. But that's another story. But the other thing that people speculated on was slaves and the slave trade. And so the slave trade now is, remember I talked about the emperor who sent explorers into the New World. That hasn't stopped. It's still going on. And there's a whole nother story that we all know too well that's happening. But people are also speculating on slaves and the slave trade. Horrible, horrible outcome of this. Who lost? The ordinary people, Protestants and Catholics, Reformed, Lutheran, Anabaptist, Minocchios, cheese and worms. Those are the people that lost in this war. By the end, they were exhausted and disillusioned with both religion and politics. They were done. They were done with destruction, with taxes, with rape, with robbery, with murder. This war really destroyed for the ordinary people of Europe what had been a feudal pyramid, because their protector, the king or the queen, was on the top. They were at the bottom, and they knew that, and they were okay with that. But they relied on the king to protect them. And in these decades, the kings and queens had not. None of the royalty had protected them, so they became very distrustful of people with guns, armies, or horses, because those people, instead of protecting them, endangered them. On the next couple of slides, I put etchings by an artist of the time whose name was Jacques Caillot. This first one is called The Hanging Tree. They're from a series of 18 etchings that he made about the 30 Years' War called The Miseries of War. And they're not pleasant to look at. The next one is called The Pillage. This is inside a house, and these are the soldiers that the mayor of Magdeburg talked about coming into people's homes, raping, pillaging, robbing. So you can see that really the people of Europe had good reason not to trust their rulers. So what the people, both Protestants and Catholics, were finding out was that the church had multiple relationships with power. And that wasn't so trustworthy either. And so I think I talked before, maybe last year, about micro-Christianities. Does this ring any bells? Okay, no. Lee says no. Explain it. Okay. Micro-Christianities, it's a word coined by a famous, wonderful historian. But instead of thinking about Christianity, or instead of thinking about Protestants or Catholics or Calvinists or Lutherans, you think about Christians who live in an area. So San Marino Community Church really is a micro-Christianity. It might be a little bit bigger sometimes when, you cooperate with other churches in programs or, in outreach, or maybe to send money to flood victims or whatever. But the Christianity that exists here in San Marino in 2018 is remarkably different from the Christianity that was in Magdeburg in the 17th century, which is different from the Christianity that was in Rome in the 16th century, which is different than the Christianity in Ethiopia in 13th century. So instead of trying to paint Christendom or think of Christendom or even big chunks of Christians, we can think of smaller units of Christians who are influenced by the time they're living in, by the place they're living in, by their rulers, by their kids, everything that you can imagine. And that is what we would call a micro-Christianity. So really, micro-Christianities are beginning to develop in different areas of Europe and develop different relationships with power. So basically, they decided, almost as one in their different places, to heck with all of you. We are done thinking about power, and they decide again to think about identifying the church. Who are we? What does it mean to be a Christian in Magdeburg after this horrible thing has happened? Can Christians in Magdeburg pray for their enemies? Can Christians in Magdeburg, do they pray for the imperial armies that came through? The answer is yes, they do, but they pray differently. And so we've got three very different prayers in the face of enemies on that handout that you have. And I'd really encourage you to take that home and think about the differences and when would you be able to pray for your enemies. And I said last week, I don't mean this to be a glib answer at all. I think too often we say, well, let's just pray about it. I don't think that's what I mean to mean. Jesus prayed until he sweat blood, right? Before the night before he was crucified. I think it's that kind of gut-wrenching, tearful, I don't get this, God, prayer that Christians at this time engaged in, and we can see in their prayers. And I think that's the kind of prayer that we have to be engaged in now. I don't have any solutions. We're in a big mess everywhere we look. But I do think that prayer is what we can do. And as we pray, sometimes light comes. And it may not be a bad idea for some of us to gather together to pray. I don't know how you all work that, but to pray together, not because we have an answer in mind, but because we are so tired and devastated that we don't know what else to do. We will next week, and we've got a couple wonderful things to end on, but I want to tell you what we'll do next week. Next week we will talk a little bit about how when Christians pulled back from power, how they thought about identifying themselves. First, they got really strict and were very orthodox and made up a lot of catechisms. Then they got kind of tired of that too, and there was a very warm pietism that came into being. And so as we conclude, I want to introduce you to one of the pietists. Her name is Eleonora Peterson. And she was a child during the 30 Years' War. So we have her memoir written, and part of it, one small paragraph, she remembers, Ellie, come right up here. She remembers it's the very end of the 30 Years' War, but she was, how old? I forget. Does she say? She was 4. And she's looking back, and this is what she remembered about the 30 Years' War.
For when I was about 4 years old, is this on? It doesn't sound. Now it's on. Yeah. Okay. For when I was about 4 years old, it happened that my parents, who had lived in Frankfurt for a while because of the war, the 30 Years' War, moved back into the country since there was peace everywhere. Many things had been taken again into the country. Also, my late mother, with my 2 sisters and myself, moved to the Philipsek estate near Hederheim, and all went well. But one day, the servants came and reported that a company of soldiers on horseback was approaching. Everyone quickly tried to save his own possessions and left my mother alone with 3 small children. The oldest was 7, I was 4 years old, and the youngest was still a baby. My mother took her youngest in her arm, took us other 2 children by the hand, and walked, without a nursemaid, all the way to Frankfurt, a distance of well over 15 miles. It was summer, and the corn was in the fields. We could hear the noise of the soldiers passing by on another road, only a pistol shot away. My mother became very frightened and admonished us to pray. When we had reached the city gates and were safe, my mother sat down with us and made us thank the Lord for protecting us. My oldest sister, who's 3 years older than I, said, "Why should we thank the Lord now when they can no longer attack us?" Then I felt a deep concern in my heart about these words. It hurt me that she did not want to thank the Lord and thought it was no longer necessary. I chided her for this out of a fervent love for God, whom I thanked with all my heart.
Isn't that interesting? So you have this don't go too far, honey. So you have this 4-year-old girl who, and they were praying on the way. Their mom says, okay, now we're going to say thank you. And her older sister is, I don't know, being recalcitrant or something. And Eleonora says, no, we must thank God. So that's the other piece of prayer as well. Then people have also remembered the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And it happened that on August 23rd in Paris in 1997, the World Youth Days were happening. And if some of you know, those are the Catholic Church draws all of the youth together from all over the world. These things are huge. And the youth actually wrote a letter. This is during Pope John Paul's papacy. And the youth of France, knowing that this was going to happen on the anniversary, remembering the Bartholomew's Day massacre, wrote a letter to the Pope about remembering. And so, Ellie, I want you to read this. And I should say, the Bishop of France, one of the bishops of France at the time, had grown up in a Jewish family and had been hidden by a Roman Catholic family during the Nazi time in France. And when that was all over, he decided to convert, and he became a priest, and then he became a bishop. But because of that formative experience in his life, he was very intent on people coming together, not being separate. And so part of his role was working with Protestants and leaders of kids from other religions also. And what they did was they put this, and you can see, I just thought, what a contrast between the St. Bartholomew's Day painting, the painting of the massacre, and what happened centuries later in the same place with all these kids coming together. So Ellie, would you read this? It's called the Charter for Living Together.
This August 24th, 1997, at the end of the 12th World Youth Days organized by the Roman Catholic Church, we, young people belonging to different religions, affirm our wish to live together and united to enter into the next millennium. This unity must be founded on a true pact of tolerance. We recognize that there is not a single youth, but rather youths, as there are multiple ways of living one's spirituality. We affirm that in order to live together, it is best to know and understand one another. It is also best to listen to one another, so as to give one another the best reception. We wish to live together by sharing our differences, so as to enrich our future projects. We wish to share the spiritual riches that are ours. We affirm the urgency of building together our future on confidence, fraternity, and solidarity, rather than on mistrust, hatred, and withdrawal into ourselves. Also, we wish to pledge ourselves to a more just and brotherly world. We believe that the dramas that buffet our world are not the product of fate. We have a share in responsibility for them. The future of this world depends equally on our individual and collective undertakings. This is why we wish to take action against any form of ideology or exclusion, fundamentalist intransigence, and fanaticism, which are sources of violence and injustice, by joining together our energies and values. Strengthened by what already unites us and respectful of our differences, we invite youths of all countries, of all religious families and confessions to join with us. Signed, the Coordinating Committee for the Charter for Living Together. a list of more than 20 Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and Eastern Orthodox organizations, collectively representing more than 300,000 young people, follows.
Good, thank you. So I think the kids have good ideas, as usual. Not just pray, but talk to each other and listen. So maybe we need to get out of our echo chambers and be patient with one another. You know what? I love my husband, but we disagree.
What?
I do. I'm picking the smallest echo chamber. And so, we go at it, but we know we'll be there when we're done, even if we haven't resolved it. And I think if we could say to one another, I'll still be here. I'll still be here, even if you believe her, even if you believe him. I'll still be here because we share a faith in a really big God, and we can trust him enough, trust God enough to know that we can stay as well. So Lee, if you would come up, we'll let Pope John Paul have the final words. This is his response to the kids, and I think it's a wonderful response.
I'll just add that besides that this is his response, that the French bishops had invited Protestants to join them in a prayer vigil intended as a time for memory and reconciliation. So there had been kind of official, talks to try to, and they actually met in the church of the one that you mentioned, the Church of Saint-Germain.
The one on the top left of the painting.
So that's where they were.
That's where they met.
They actually met for this time, and they the Pope had called them in preparing for the new millennium to look more critically into past silences and omissions on the part of the Catholic Church. Obviously, you can't do that on behalf of the Protestant Church, but that's.
But we could.
Yeah, but we could. Yeah. So this is what the Pope. I'm sorry. This is 1997.
John Paul
So this is
II.
Pope John Paul II. Yeah.
On the anniversary of
Yeah.
the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
This is what he said. On the eve of 24 August, we cannot forget the sad massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, an event of very obscure causes in the political and religious history of France. Christians did things which the gospel condemns. If I speak of the past, it is because, and here he's quoting from the letter that the students had written, acknowledging the weaknesses of the past is an act of honesty and courage, which helps us to strengthen our faith, which alerts us to face today's temptations and challenges and prepares us to meet them. That's the end of that quote. Therefore, I willingly support the initiatives of the French bishops, for with them I am convinced that only forgiveness, offered and received, leads little by little to a fruitful dialogue, which will in turn ensure a fully Christian reconciliation. Belonging to different religious traditions must not constitute today a source of opposition and tension. Quite the contrary, our common love for Christ impels us to seek tirelessly the path of full unity.
Thanks. I don't know what it means to seek tirelessly the path of full unity. Sometimes it's hard to even know who you're trying to be unified with. But I do know that God is faithful. And we see God's faithfulness throughout generations. And I am sure that even if we can't see it, our children's children's children will be able to look back And when Ellie's great-great-granddaughter is doing this for the next generation of San Marino church folks, she'll be able to look back and say, look how God was faithful. Look how they prayed for their enemies. Look how they listened. God is faithful. All right, that's enough for today. And we'll come back next week and we'll talk not so much about power and politics at all, but about how Christians began to identify themselves apart from politics. And we'll see a catechism for mothers and babes. All right, thank you.